Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you. I remember the day I first toured the house vividly. It was a charming 2-bedroom bungalow in a suburban neighborhood just outside Pittsburgh, with a neat little front yard and a backyard garden that looked like something out of a home improvement magazine. The rent was a bit steep, but after a long search, I was just relieved to find a place within my budget and close enough to my new job. The landlord, Karen, greeted me at the door with a big, toothy smile. She looked like someone's pleasant, chatty aunt, bubbly, wearing floral prints, practically humming with energy. I found her slightly overbearing, but I brushed aside my reservations, chalking it up to nerves about starting a new chapter in my life. Karen wasted no time telling me how much she loved her pride and joy, as she called the house. She spoke about how she'd spent years fixing it up after inheriting it from her late aunt, who had originally built the property in the 1950s. When I pointed out how fresh the paint job looked, her eyes lit up, and she delved into a detailed story about the countless weekends she spent repainting every room herself. She seemed proud of the place, and I admired that. At that moment, I genuinely believed I'd found a caring, involved landlord, maybe a bit eccentric, but seemingly with a good heart. Once we walked inside, the bungalow's interior felt homely, even if some corners showed a bit of age. There was a faint scent of lemon polish on the wooden floors, and family photos lined the walls. Oddly enough, most of those photos featured Karen herself, posing in front of landmarks, hugging distant relatives, or simply smiling in front of a birthday cake. She had the vibe of a person who liked being the center of attention, but again, I convinced myself that maybe she was just trying to be open with me. She kept reminding me how the house had lots of memories, though she didn't elaborate on what exactly went on here. It gave me a slight chill, but I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. During our conversation, she repeatedly dropped hints about her philosophy of renting. She claimed she preferred to think of tenants as extended family and was looking for someone who would respect her legacy. While I found the wording unusual, the sentiment sounded nice on the surface. After dealing with distant property managers in the past, I thought having a more involved landlord might be a good thing. Before I knew it, I'd signed the lease. She handed me the keys, practically bouncing on her heels with excitement. The first few weeks were unremarkable. I focused on getting settled, unpacking boxes, and starting my new job. As a gesture of gratitude for letting me move in a week early, I trimmed the small hedges out front and watered the roses in the backyard. Karen would pop by occasionally in the daytime, mainly to ask if I was settling in well and if I needed help with anything. It felt a bit intrusive. She'd seldom text or call before showing up, but she always came with some neighborly gift, like a plate of homemade cookies or a vase of cut flowers. The repeated pop-ins were awkward, but I tried to stay polite. After all, it was her place, and I wanted to keep a good relationship. Then small red flags started appearing. One evening, I came home from work to find Karen standing on the front porch, peering through the window. When I walked up the driveway, she turned, startled, and acted like she'd just arrived. I told her politely she could have texted me if she needed anything. She laughed it off, saying she was just passing by and wanted to make sure the porch light was working. I felt uneasy but dismissed the feeling. In the bigger scheme, it still seemed minor. A few days later, I noticed that my living room blinds had been adjusted in a way I never left them. My mail, which I typically stacked on the little table by the door, was scattered on the floor as if someone had moved it. I called Karen to ask if she'd been inside. She hemmed and hawed before insisting she only stepped in to tidy the place up and to make sure I hadn't left any appliances on. I was starting to see the cracks in her landlord as family approach. Apparently, she believed family had no boundaries. When I gently reminded her that unannounced visits and entering without permission were not okay, she got defensive. Her reasoning? She didn't need a formal invitation to check on her property. We ended up in a tense standoff. In the end, she apologized, but with a subtle jab, saying she just wanted the best and implying I was overly sensitive. That passive-aggressive behavior put me on edge, but I tried to smooth things over for the sake of avoiding conflict. I told myself it might just take some time for both of us to adapt to our new arrangement. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. Karen's meddling would escalate until even the friendliest neighbor would have been tempted to call the police. For me, the nightmare was quietly setting in, about to show its true colors in the most unexpected ways. I tried to maintain a polite relationship with Karen despite the mounting red flags. Each time I brought up the need for her to respect my privacy, she'd nod and say she understood. For a brief spell, things would improve, but then, just as I thought we'd turned a corner, another intrusive incident would crop up. It became a maddening cycle of promises followed by broken boundaries. The final straw of this pattern happened on a weekend when I was enjoying a quiet Sunday morning. I had planned to stay in, read a good book, and catch up on laundry. Around midday, I heard the faint sound of movement near the side of the house. Peeking out the kitchen window, I saw Karen rummaging through what looked like old pieces of lumber. I had no idea when or why she'd arrived. All I could think was, please don't let her come barging in. But sure enough, 5 minutes later, the doorknob rattled and she let herself in using her own key. Startled, I confronted her, feeling the anxiety churn in my stomach. She explained, in a slow, condescending tone, that she needed one of the wooden planks to fix a loose step in her own garage at home. When I pointed out that she could have texted or knocked, she simply waved me off. She made it sound like I should be grateful that she was improving the property for the next tenant, her words, not mine. That comment stung, and I couldn't help wondering if she was looking to replace me. Instead of apologizing, Karen tried to redirect my attention by pointing at my laundry basket in the living room, scolding me about sorting whites and colors together. It was the most bizarre experience, like having an overbearing relative show up unannounced to lecture you about housekeeping. At that moment, I firmly stated that her repeated boundary breaches were unacceptable. Karen scoffed as though I were blowing things out of proportion. She repeated the same excuse. Since it was her house, she had a right to pop in. By then, I could feel my face turning red with frustration. I told her straight up, this has to stop. The next day, I installed a simple interior chain lock on the front door, the kind you can slide into place when you're inside. It didn't prevent her from using her key if I was out, but at least I'd have a sense of security when I was home. She noticed it about a week later when I was in the shower and she tried to enter without warning. I heard the rattling at the door, followed by her calling my name irritably. When I opened the door, hair still dripping, she glared at the chain lock like it was an offense to her entire existence. That evening, I discovered a handwritten letter slipped under my door. In it, Karen accused me of violating the spirit of our lease by making alterations without her permission. She threatened to terminate the lease if I didn't remove the lock immediately. My stomach sank. I had no illusions about how expensive and draining it would be to move again, let alone find a new place on such short notice. But at the same time, living under her scrutiny was quickly becoming unbearable. I decided to familiarize myself with the local rental laws. After a few hours of research and phone calls to a local tenant rights hotline, I learned that landlords are indeed required to provide reasonable notice before entering. If they fail to do so, the tenant can file a complaint. Moreover, the chain lock I installed was a standard security measure that most renters are allowed to put in place without penalty. My lease had no specific clause forbidding it, either. Feeling a spark of determination, I wrote Karen a polite but firm email outlining these points. I attached screenshots from my local government's housing website confirming that her repeated entries without proper notice were unlawful. Her response was immediate and predictably fiery. She accused me of threatening her with legislation and insisted that by renting her property, I was essentially taking advantage of her kindness. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen's version of kindness was borderline harassment. To my surprise, though, her email also included a new set of house rules she wanted me to follow, covering everything from lawn care to setting a limit on how many guests I could have at a time. Most were not in the original lease. She ended the message with a line that sent a chill up my spine. If you don't like it, you're free to leave. Suddenly, the dynamic shifted from a minor annoyance to a full-on power struggle. I sensed she was itching for a confrontation. Perhaps she believed I'd back down, quietly obey her, or pack my bags and go. However, I had no intention of giving in so easily, not when I had legal ground to stand on. I resolved to keep documenting every interaction, every odd visit, every new demand. If Karen wanted a battle, she'd have to fight me in a fair arena, preferably one that had a judge to see through her manipulations. Little did I know, she wasn't going to back down either. And soon enough, her antics would escalate far beyond intrusive visits and scolding letters, landing both of us in territory neither of us wanted to explore. But by then, it would be too late to turn back. Things really started spiraling when Karen initiated what could only be described as a harassment campaign. She began by plastering sticky notes on my car windshield with passive-aggressive messages like, "Please keep your trash bins in order, or else." I thought maybe it was a neighbor being petty, but I recognized her unmistakable handwriting from the letter she'd left under my door. Then one evening, I came home from the grocery store to find a note taped to the front door. It read, "You're violating the lease by not mowing the lawn weekly. Expect a fine." Her signature was scrawled at the bottom. Fuming, I checked my lease. There was nothing about a mandatory weekly mow. I only had to keep the lawn in reasonable condition. As it happened, I just mowed it 5 days earlier, scarcely enough time for the grass to grow noticeably. It became clear that she was inventing rules to corner me. Resolved not to be intimidated, I saved every note and snapped photos of the lawn as evidence. The tension reached a new high 2 weeks later when Karen showed up with a measuring tape, literally measuring my grass. She was pacing around the yard, glaring at me through the living room window while I was on a Zoom call for work. Irritated and more than a bit rattled, I stepped outside and asked her what she was doing. She mumbled something about potential code violations, but her real goal seemed to be to provoke me. When I calmly asked her to leave so I could return to my meeting, she snapped back with, "I'm well within my rights to ensure my property is maintained." My neighbors glanced over curiously. It was embarrassing to be in the middle of a standoff on a perfectly ordinary weekday. A few days after that bizarre incident, I got a surprise visit from the local police. 2 officers knocked on my door, and to my shock, they told me they were responding to a complaint. Karen had accused me of destroying property by intentionally flooding the bathroom. Thoroughly perplexed, I invited them in to see the supposed damage. Of course, there was nothing of the sort, just a normal, dry bathroom. The officers seemed almost apologetic, explaining that they had to follow up on any formal complaint. But the damage was done. The entire neighborhood saw the squad car in front of the house, fueling rumors that I was a troublesome tenant. I wasted no time. Right after the officers left, I called the same tenant rights hotline I'd consulted before. They advised me to continue documenting everything and suggested I might consider filing a harassment or wrongful eviction complaint if Karen's behavior persisted. One representative mentioned that if she kept making false police reports, I had grounds to escalate matters legally. Armed with this information, I felt a bit more confident, though I was emotionally drained. Every day felt like a new confrontation or an unwelcome surprise. A week later, Karen slapped me with a formal notice to vacate, claiming I was in violation of unspecified clauses in the lease. The document was handwritten and barely legible, with no lawyer's letterhead or any official formatting. She demanded I move out within 30 days or face an eviction lawsuit. I immediately contacted a local attorney who offered a free consultation. After reading the lease and the so-called eviction notice, the attorney concluded Karen had no valid grounds to evict me. Additionally, her repeated attempts to coerce me out of the property could be seen as a form of constructive eviction, which is illegal if the landlord can't provide legitimate reasons supported by the lease or by law. Despite the attorney's reassurance, stress consumed me. Every moment I spent in that house felt tense and unpredictable. I couldn't shake the sense that Karen was lurking, waiting to pounce with the next baseless accusation. My phone would buzz, and I'd half expect it to be another text from her, something about a leaf on the walkway or the thickness of the grass. Small ordinary things became triggers for anxiety. Living there, I was in a constant state of alert. In an attempt at a final olive branch, I sent Karen a carefully worded letter, this time via certified mail, requesting we mediate the issues with a neutral third party. I laid out the facts, her unannounced visits, her fabricated lease violations, her false police complaint, and the letter from my attorney. I cited the relevant sections of Pennsylvania's tenant-landlord law, hoping she'd realize she was in dangerous territory if she kept pushing. I wasn't trying to be combative, I just wanted a stable living situation until my lease ended. She never responded in writing. Instead, I got an angry voicemail the following day, in which she ranted that I was bringing trouble into her life and that she'd do whatever it took to regain control of her house. That message made it clear, negotiations were a dead end. I braced myself for the coming storm, half expecting an official eviction lawsuit or even more outlandish stunts. As unbelievable as it all felt, this was my reality, and I had to follow it through. I had no idea just how intense the final act would become. If Karen was determined to push this into court, I was equally prepared to defend my rights with every resource I had. One thing was certain, neither of us was going to back down quietly. Sure enough, Karen filed an eviction lawsuit 2 weeks later. I received the official notice from the local courthouse, listing a slew of bogus reasons for my removal. She claimed I'd damaged the plumbing, failed to pay rent on time, and engaged in disruptive behavior detrimental to the neighborhood. My attorney and I combed through her accusations. Every claim was either a gross exaggeration or outright fabrication. I had receipts showing I paid rent electronically on the 1st of every month, along with time-stamped photographs of the property in good condition. The court date couldn't come soon enough. Living under that roof with a looming legal battle felt surreal. Karen, for her part, turned up the pressure. She'd blast loud music outside in the middle of the night, then call the police on me for disturbing the peace. Each time officers came by, they left shaking their heads when they saw the real situation. And yet, every false report further chipped away at my sense of security. On the morning of the hearing, I showed up at the courthouse dressed in a simple suit, clutching a binder of neatly organized evidence, photos, text messages, emails, even the sticky notes she'd left on my car. My attorney assured me we had a strong case. Still, I couldn't help feeling a knot in my stomach. Karen arrived with an air of confidence, wearing a bright floral blouse and her signature smug grin. She carried a stack of papers that looked suspiciously like random printouts from the internet. As we waited for the judge, she didn't once look my way, though I noticed her tapping her foot impatiently. When the case was called, Karen launched into a dramatic rant about how I was the tenant from hell, describing me as negligent, disrespectful, and a menace to the neighborhood. She waved around photos that had nothing to do with my tenancy, like pictures of a flooded basement from years ago, presumably from a different incident altogether. My attorney calmly requested that she stick to facts relevant to our case. Each time Karen tried to pivot to a new accusation, the judge pressed her to show concrete evidence. She came up short every time. Then it was our turn. My attorney presented a timeline of events, complete with Karen's texts about weekly lawn care, her unannounced visits, and the threat-filled notes. I had copies of my rent receipts, all timely, and the official police documentation stating that the complaint about flooding was unfounded. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to visibly unimpressed with Karen's antics. As the hearing progressed, Karen's bravado faded. She began interrupting, throwing in random allegations, like how I supposedly invited suspicious guests who parked crookedly on the street. It was almost comical, but mostly sad. After hearing both sides, the judge ruled that Karen's eviction case had no merit. In a firm tone, the judge reminded Karen of the legal requirement to give proper notice before entering a tenant's home. He even warned her that continued harassment could lead to legal penalties against her. I felt an immense wave of relief when the judge officially dismissed the eviction. More importantly, he ordered that I be allowed to remain on the property until the lease expired, unless we both reached a mutual agreement to terminate it early. Outside the courtroom, Karen shot me a furious glare, then stormed off without a word. Over the next few days, the atmosphere at the house was strangely quiet. She didn't appear unannounced, and the threatening notes ceased. Perhaps the humiliation of losing in court had finally tempered her desire to play landlord tyrant. Regardless, the damage was done. My nerves were shot, and I knew I had no intention of staying under the same roof once my lease ended. A month later, Karen sent me a curt email proposing a buyout. She'd pay me $1,000 if I agreed to terminate the lease early and move out. My attorney advised me to negotiate for a slightly higher figure, given the trouble she'd caused me. We settled on $1,500, plus the return of my full security deposit. The day I packed my final box into a moving truck, Karen showed up in her car at the end of the driveway, watching silently as I drove off. It was a bittersweet moment, relief at finally escaping her grasp, mixed with residual anger at how much stress she had put me through. Now that I'm free, I've been reflecting on the experience. If I had to do it over again, I'd have dug deeper into the landlord's background or asked previous tenants about their experiences before signing a lease. I'd also have been more proactive about installing cameras and contacting authorities sooner. But hindsight is always 20/20ths. In the end, the legal system worked the way it should, but not without draining me emotionally and financially. I share this story for anyone who might find themselves in a similar predicament. Trust your instincts. Document every interaction. And don't let a landlord, or anyone else, bully you out of your basic rights. As for Karen, wherever she is now, I can only hope she's learned that meddling in a tenant's life and trying to weaponize the law can backfire in the most humiliating way. But honestly, knowing her, she's probably still blaming me for everything. Either way, I'm just grateful it's over, and I'll never take a drama-free rental for granted again.